After getting seriously wounded in combat, this soldier lost his usefulness on the front lines and turned to making a living as an inventor, which ended up giving him the ambition to create something that could change the course of the war and prevent his people from being defeated. Hey guys, today on Turbo Recap we're following AK-47, a war and action movie released in 2020, so let's get right into it. We start off seeing a young Mikhail Kalashnikov building a toy rifle hidden from his brothers, and then he stashes the thing in a safe spot to go play with the others, even though his father was well aware of the kid's little creations. Years go by, and by 1941, Kalashnikov is already a sergeant serving in World War II as a tank commander in the Red Army, and while fighting at the Battle of Bryansk to take down the enemy, he ends up getting wounded after destroying a German anti-tank gun. After that, the soldier is pulled from the front lines and wakes up in a medical ward with other war casualties, and after some rest, he gets discharged to head back home, catching a ride in a truck, except halfway there the thing gets stuck in the mud and the men can't get it out. That's when Kalashnikov spots a village on the other side where they could get a horse to help, managing to convince his buddy Sahakya to go with him, so the soldier takes the lead on the mission carrying his PPSH-41, which was a new model used by the Russians. Curious, the sergeant takes an interest in the weapon since he wanted to build his own automatic machine gun, but the soldier had never fired it and didn't even know if it worked properly. And when they stop near a horse tied up in the middle of nowhere, Sahakya leaves Kalashnikov with a TT-33 and goes for the animal. Right then, two Germans come out of one of the houses, drawing the attention of another one who was hiding, so Sahakya takes out the first two, but the gun jams when facing the third, who shoots him in the chest. But Kalashnikov finishes the guy off and rushes to help his buddy, who complains about the weapon failing him. Then the sergeant finds an old man who owns the horse and helps them get back where they came from. And on the way, Kalashnikov examines his buddy's submachine gun, finding that it had water inside which froze the firing mechanism, and that's when he reveals his talent for building weapons, and that he'd been an inventor since childhood. With that, the two return to the group, and with the old man's horse, the truck is pulled out of the mud, allowing them to continue their trip to a busy train station, where he only manages to board thanks to his wounded arm in a sling. During the trip, Kalashnikov befriends a war hero who lost both his arms in battle, telling him about his ambition to create an automatic machine gun to help the Allies, and when the man sees his sketches, he encourages the sergeant to keep pushing forward and help them with his new invention. Motivated, Kalashnikov decides not to go home and gets off the train, leaving his companions behind, and then he heads to a workshop to talk to his former boss Krotov, looking for a job, but seeing the state the soldier was in, unable to even hold a hammer, the guy refuses to help him. But the sergeant is persistent and insists on trying to convince him to give him a chance. The problem is, the guy remembers that back when he worked there, Kalashnikov used the workshop to build all kinds of weapon projects, which ended up being a huge headache for the old man who almost got arrested because of it. Because of that, Krotov tells the soldier to get lost, leaving Kalashnikov stranded in that city, and while hoping for a miracle, he hears the military announcing the arrival of a high-ranking officer named Borisov, so the guy doesn't waste any time and rushes to try to get his help with his inventions. During the conversation, the sergeant even starts off with some cheap sentimentality, but quickly catches Borisov's attention with his idea, and believe it or not, he returns to Krotov with an authorization from the guy, forcing his former boss to set him up with a workspace and everything he needed. It might not have been the best place in the world, but at least it was enough for Kalashnikov to put his ideas on paper and move forward with the project. The problem is, he was going to need skilled labor, and Krotov refuses to arrange that, turning against the sergeant and humiliating him for his inventions never working out. With that, the guy decides to keep going with what he already had, even using just one hand to do everything, and then he gets a visit from the engineer Eugene and some volunteers interested in helping him, which gives the sergeant more hope that he could actually help the Russians in battle with his creations. Now guys, you gotta hand it to Kalashnikov for his persistence in going after a spot for himself in that workshop. The bad part is the place is run by a guy who doesn't even like him because of old beef, and that can't be good, since he needed to prove himself to someone who couldn't care less about the sergeant. And let's be real, it takes guts to ditch the train ride home just to follow your gut without being afraid of taking a shot in the dark, so Kalashnikov is definitely not going to throw this opportunity away, or else it'll be decades of work to make up for lost time. Back to the movie, time passes, and Kalashnikov makes great progress bringing his submachine gun to life, and then the group heads out to test the weapon's range and accuracy, with Eugene being the lucky one who gets to fire the prototype, leaving everyone stunned by how effective it was, especially the sergeant who feels truly accomplished. Proud of himself, Kalashnikov decides to bring the weapon to Borisov to show him that his authorization wasn't for nothing, but the guards end up arresting the guy by mistake thinking he was an enemy, and when an officer arrives, he's surprised by the design and sends the weapon to be analyzed by a specialist. During that time, Kalashnikov is mocked by the guards who didn't see an ounce of inventor in the guy, not knowing that far away the weapons professionals were blown away by the project, seeing great potential for it within the Russian army. With that, the officer returns with the verdict from the analysis and confirms the story the sergeant told, ordering the guards to release Kalashnikov, who obviously takes the chance to stare those fools right in the eyes when he's freed, and they just stand there looking completely dumbfounded. Then, the soldier is properly fed and instructed to create a lighter version of the weapon, suggesting he enter a military weapons design competition so the submachine gun could be mass-produced if he won. And seeing the chance he had to make his dreams come true, the sergeant accepts the offer. The next day, Kalashnikov gets nervous before showing his creation to General Kropotkin, who already looks at the soldier with very little faith, but he goes through with the test and is quite impressed by the results, so he approves the sergeant for the national design competition, believing in his potential. After that, Kalashnikov travels to Moscow to study for the competition and improve his designs, and it's during this trip that he meets Alexei Sudayev, a prestigious inventor who would be his opponent in the competition, which fortunately doesn't stop them from building a solid friendship and rooting for each other. So the sergeant arrives at the testing grounds where only the top weapons geniuses studied, and then the facility's colonel introduces his new partner Vasily, who would help him with his ideas. So the guy shows him around the campus and Kalashnikov's workspace, giving him his first task of drawing his submachine gun. But the sergeant wasn't good at drawing, and Vasily asks his assistant Ekaterina to help him with that part, except the woman waits until lunchtime to approach him, and even shows up warning that she didn't like flirting at work, startling poor Kalashnikov, who just wanted to eat his soup in peace. After that, the soldier and the competitors have their weapons tested at the training grounds, and when Alexei shows up to greet him, the sergeant is surprised to see General Degty's group, who Kalashnikov considered to be his biggest rival, and was so respected that he didn't even need to show up for the tests. Later on, the sergeant is visited by Ekaterina, who starts taking apart the weapons pieces to draw them, except Kalashnikov can't help but stare at her shamelessly, to the point of even leaving the room to give her some space, only to actually stand outside watching the woman like a lovesick fool. With the good results he's been getting, Kalashnikov decides to thank Ekaterina for her effort in helping him by giving her a bag of sugar as a gift, and even asks to walk her home since after the competition they'd be far away from each other, so she accepts the invitation and they head off together. That's when the two walk through a plaza full of people dancing, and Ekaterina drops hints for the guy to invite her to the dance floor, but he's way too clueless and gets left in the dust by an officer who asks for her hand, and the woman accepts, ignoring the fact that she was with her co-worker, who just stands there like a total wallflower. At the end of the dance, Ekaterina even thanks the sergeant for the dance, creating a pretty awkward moment, but it gets worse when the officer comes back again, wanting to walk her home, leaving Kalashnikov furious, except the situation makes the girl annoyed too, and they both storm off mad at each other. Then the sergeant follows Ekaterina, who thanks him for the sugar, mentioning that her daughter loved sweets, and with this discovery, he asks where her husband was, but the woman says she didn't have one anymore, which makes Kalashnikov happy, knowing there was an opening to win over the lovely lady. Alright guys, I love it when someone who gets picked on comes back on top with class, so props to Kalashnikov for showing those soldiers they were total chumps. The bad part is seeing the guy with Ekaterina without making any moves and giving the spotlight to that smooth-talking officer. That said, it's cool to see that even though Ekaterina had her guard up from the start, she gives in pretty easily to the sergeant's eccentric ways. And you can't watch the way this guy behaves without being reminded of Sheldon Cooper and his robotic personality, which should tell you that Kalashnikov is truly one of the geniuses of engineering. Back to the movie, morning comes, and Kalashnikov gets the results from the test, finding out that his weapon lost to Alexei's, but the guy doesn't let his friend get discouraged by it, showing that he was still one of the best there, and even says that this was just the beginning for the noble sergeant. Even with the compliments, Kalashnikov reaches the point of wanting to give up on everything and go back to the front lines, but Vasily encourages him to compete again, except this time in Kazakhstan, to create a new machine gun, which makes him hesitant since he'd be far from Ekaterina, but he accepts in the end. With that, the man goes back to Krotov's workshop and runs into General Kropotkin, and the guy is disappointed with Kalashnikov's attitude after losing confidence in himself, since the old sergeant was too stubborn to let any obstacle stop him from moving forward. And it's with that motivation that Kalashnikov spends the entire night drawing his new creation, achieving an impressive evolution in the design of what could be Russia's salvation in the war, and even his superior is shocked by the power and accuracy of the new weapon. Sometime later, Kalashnikov has the displeasure of meeting Captain Lobov, a stuck-up soldier who thought he was better than everyone else, and right off the bat the guy mocks the sergeant's automatic rifle to his face without a care in the world, and then the two head to the station and the officer leaves to check on some information. At that moment, Kalashnikov is recognized by Victor, his brother, who was locked in a train car along with several prisoners of war, and the guy has to make the tough decision of holding on to everything he's achieved so far and leaving behind one of his few living relatives who was taken away into oblivion. But Lobov had seen everything and starts starts suspecting whether Kalashnikov really was who he claimed to be. So during the trip, he tries to force the sergeant to drink with him to get some truths out, which doesn't work since the man wanted nothing to do with the captain. But Lobov isn't satisfied being turned down by the sergeant, thinking the guy considered himself better than the captain, and Kalashnikov tries to defend himself, while the dude kept spouting cheap philosophy, giving the idiot enough time to even knock over the bottle of booze he was going to use to get him drunk. After that fiasco, the two get off the train and walk toward the testing grounds assigned to Kalashnikov. But there comes a point where even he didn't know where he was going anymore, increasing Lobov's suspicion, who pulls a gun thinking he was an enemy infiltrator. But the sergeant doesn't take the provocations and insults the captain, who punches him in the face, and when he gets close to Kalashnikov, the guy grabs the officer's weapon and knocks the fool out cold, admitting that he hadn't seen his brother in over a decade and was just happy to see him alive. After everything that happened, Kalashnikov returns to find Ekaterina so they could catch up with each other, and they even walk through a storm just to get to her place, and there the two finally take this chance to have their first real moment of peace. The next morning, Vasily announces the winners of the competition, and Kalashnikov is disappointed to hear that nobody won, with there still being room for whoever wanted to keep working there, but on different ideas, which makes the sergeant storm out of there angry, leaving Ekaterina behind. Feeling like a failure as a weapons designer, Kalashnikov goes to the barracks doctor to ask to go back to the front lines, and the guy tries his hardest to convince the doctor that he was fit for duty, but the man won't allow it, saying he'd be useless on the front lines and sending him back to his workbench. Then, the sergeant is comforted by Vasily, who confesses that he also lost in the competition, but just like everyone else, he praises Kalashnikov's project, saying he just needed a little more confidence, and even suggests that the inventor stay there working with them, which leaves the officer quite thoughtful. After that, Kalashnikov is invited by Ekaterina to meet her mother for the first time, and when she arrives, the lady seems to have some kind of problem with him right away, but during dinner the sergeant makes sure to prove his love for his assistant by asking for her hand in marriage without any hesitation. Now united, the winds of fortune seem to be changing not just for the couple, but also for Russia, as one of the soldiers arrives announcing that the country had won the Great Patriotic War, which everyone celebrates together after so many years of conflict and loss. However, later on Kalashnikov realizes that with the war over his new automatic rifle wouldn't even have a purpose anymore, making him lose his drive once again, and being comforted by Ekaterina, who even in the most critical moments could still make her husband feel at ease. So, the man goes to the colonel to ask if all his effort had been for nothing just like that, but the officer shows him a letter requesting more advanced weaponry, which meant that Kalashnikov could not only continue his work, but would also get his own department. With renewed hope, Kalashnikov starts leading his engineers in creating his new model, which he named the AK, receiving a visit from Alexei, who's immediately eager to see the prototype, saying that if everything worked out, the sergeant's inventions would surpass anything else in there, and the news about his AK ends up reaching his rival Degty, who invites him to work at his factory in Kovrov, except Kalashnikov is apprehensive, thinking the guy wouldn't make his work any easier, being encouraged by Ekaterina to set his fears aside and go chase his dreams. So Kalashnikov travels to Kovrov, meeting his new collaborator Alexander, to help him at the workshop, and the sergeant almost gets the chance to see Degty in person, but the guy hides behind his limousine, which seems to give the officer even more fuel to get started on his machine gun. After a long period of work, and with just days left before the competition, Kalashnikov is dying to test his AK, but gets blocked from the testing site because they're focused on Degty's weapon, leaving the sergeant so frustrated that he goes after higher-ups to help him get the weapon tested, but can't get anywhere. Seeing that he couldn't afford to waste time waiting, the man decides to test his weapon alone, heading to the outside of the factory, setting up a small target on a barrel, and opening fire in a public area, which helps him see that his AK was perfect and ready to be used by soldiers. But that doesn't stop him from being detained by his colleagues because of the danger he caused, being taken to speak with General Degty, and feeling pretty uncomfortable in front of his arch-rival, which the officer himself uses to take jabs at Kalashnikov about his mediocre inventions. That's when the guy says he was actually impressed by the AK, even though it wasn't the best weapon ever made, which hits the sergeant like a stab to his ego with no way to fight back. Still, the general is surprised to find out that Kalashnikov hadn't even finished his formal education, learning practically everything on his own as a self-taught genius. That's when Degty asks to test Kalashnikov's AK before he takes it to the competition, making the sergeant worried that the guy might steal his ideas to build his own weapon, but the old man claims his machine gun was already finished and he was just curious to see how the competitors were progressing. So guys, it's amazing to see that even without a solid academic background, Kalashnikov was highly capable thanks to being self-taught. People like that can be a real find when you want to learn something, since picking up a new skill without needing a teacher is really important nowadays. On top of that, we saw that even though he has a humble personality, his rebellious side is also there, and it's no joke, since the guy barely got himself himself a workshop just to focus on his ideas, and already found a way to risk losing everything by being too impatient to wait for the tests. With that, Kalashnikov shows his creation to the general, taking apart every piece so he could understand how it worked, and then the man reassembles the weapon, being impressed by the details of the AK, believing that it was so superior to his own project that he decides to drop out of the competition to the guy's surprise. So the day of reckoning finally arrives, and the two finalists' weapons are tested by the officers, with the first being the Balkan, which when submerged in water ends up failing to eject a cartridge, and when the model is buried in sand it also jams when firing and gets discarded. And then it's time for Kalashnikov's weapon to be tested, so a soldier submerges it in water, seeing that it still performed flawlessly, which carries over when it's buried in sand and still works without a single failure until the end of the test. At the end of the competition, Kalashnikov meets up with Ekaterina and gives her the news that his weapon was approved for mass production. And to make things even better, the woman reveals that she's pregnant, giving the two plenty to celebrate in one day. Now in 1949, Kalashnikov is congratulated by his colleagues and also by Artillery Marshal Voronov, who calls the sergeant over for a walk to learn more about his motivations. And during that time, the man expresses his wish to see his mother again after so many years, but says he wouldn't be able to because of work. Then the two arrive where a battalion of Russian soldiers was waiting for them carrying Kalashnikov's weapon, and there he's decorated for creating the AK-47, being recognized as one of the greatest inventors, even receiving an unexpected embrace from the marshal, who promises to sign a leave for him to see his mother. In the end, we see Kalashnikov returning to the green fields of Altai alongside his wife Ekaterina and their little daughters, being welcomed with open arms by his dear mother after years of being gone. So guys, do you have any invention ideas you'd like to see created? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to watch more videos like this one, just click on those two popping up on your screen. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.